Our understanding of India's economy is based on the assumption and several reports that have suggested that India is emerging from the shadows of the pandemic, and so is our economy. But now, a new research paper by Dr. Arvind Panagariya actually questions those studies that suggest that the lockdown and what followed in the pandemic years caused both inequality and poverty in rural and urban India to rise. In fact, this paper, the Dr. Arvind Panagariya, who was, of course, the vice chairman of the NITI Aayog and is one of the world's most respected political economists, actually argues that quarter on quarter after the pandemic, poverty has actually been on the decline. This finding goes against what several other economists have been arguing. Just on this program a few days ago, Raghuram Rajan, for example, was extremely concerned about India's growth figures. But looking at Dr. Panagariya's figures, we see a very, very different picture emerge. In fact, Dr. Panagariya squarely takes on research papers, including those from the Azim Premji University, that argued that 230 million Indians had been pushed into poverty as a result of measures that were taken during the pandemic. There's a lot to talk about, including the larger health of India's economy, the road to 2024, and Modinomics, whether the Prime Minister's economic policies might be a big political factor in what ends up happening or not happening in the next general election. Let's go across now live to our newsmaker on the program today. Arvind Panagariya is with us. It's a pleasure, sir, to have you with us. And I read your paper with great interest. It's captured all of the headlines here in India, because in some ways what you're arguing seems so counterintuitive. When we look back at that time, there's that sense of an economic freeze, as it were, people losing not just their sources of income, but also their capacity to spend, one of the points that you make in your paper. Now, why do you argue that claims that poverty and inequality both increased significantly during and after the pandemic are patently false? That's the phrase you use. Can you elaborate why?
Thank you, Barkha. Really pleasure to be on your program, to be with you. Uh, the paper is a bit more nuanced than you may have
Yes,
put it.
yes. I'm trying to make it accessible to the layperson, but I'm sure you will correct us and help us and guide us through a more complex understanding of what's happening. Go ahead, sir.
Yes. So when I say patently false, I'm really referring to rural poverty.
Yes.
What this research really shows is that rural poverty did rise only in that one single quarter, which is the April to June 2020. That was the period of very strict lockdown. And after that, it came back to its path of declining poverty. And subsequently, whether you look at the data by quarter or if you want to look at the data annually, poverty continues to decline. Now, the rate of decline of poverty does fall in 1920, I think. We can look at the data, the estimates, but that is the finding. Now, urban poverty, on the other hand, did rise for at least 4 quarters, the same strict lockdown
Yes.
quarter.
Yes. In fact, I'm quoting from your paper right there, and it says rural poverty saw a modest rise only during the strict lockdown quarter of 2020.
Correct. So
Yes.
that is exactly right statement. Also, if you look at urban poverty also by quarter, it's not a massive rise in poverty. The percentage point increases are between something like 1 to 4 percentage points during these 4 quarters. So this is the April to June 2020 quarter and the 3 quarters that follow. Once again, by the time we come to the April-June quarter of 2021, urban poverty begins to decline again, which is where I think my data set end. And not,
Yes.
very recently, the 21-22 PLFS survey has been released, but we still don't have the unit level data yet, but we will try to extend to that. Now, if you give me a minute, I want to explain why actually the claims of a massive rise in poverty in rural areas were actually themselves counterintuitive. And to me, it was much more intuitive to think in what the results that this research shows. to me, they are far more intuitive for the following reasons. The growth in agriculture, which is crucial to rural poverty, continued to be on a very high growth trajectory. Our trend growth rate, if you take the trend, let's say over a 30-year period, 1990s onwards, it's less than 3%. Now, agriculture had grown in 2019-20, 5.3 or 5.4%. I mean, it's above 5%, which is unusual growth rate for agriculture.
Yeah.
Following year also, 2020-21, agriculture grew 3.3%, which is also above trend. And the rural economy, tends to be very much driven by what happens in agriculture. It's not all agriculture, obviously. Perhaps, we don't know the full estimates, but perhaps half of the rural income might be non-agricultural. But still, that is a big driver. So that's one factor. The other factors are that, the government also pitched in at speed, at pretty good speed. So they were able to, raise the Narega expenditure, for example, even in 1920. Remember, 1920 is only the last 10 days. This is the fiscal year 1920. The survey year is more like July 1 to June 30. But so it's the fiscal year and the survey year are sort of not fully aligned. So if you look at the Narega expenditure, it went up from 618 billion in 1819 to 717 billion in 1920. Now remember that it's only last 10 days of 1920, which are part of the lockdown and all. And then in 2021, Narega expenditure goes to 1.1 trillion rupees. So that was a big jump. And then there was that, Prime Minister's Gramin Kalyan Ann Yojana, PMGKAY, under which 5 kilograms of additional food grain was given free of charge to about 800 million people. And that program also kicked in very quickly. So I think these were the big factors. And for these reasons, actually, to me, the declining rural poverty actually is a more intuitive.
Fascinating. And actually your paper begins with a sort of critique or a reference to two different research papers. One of them was from the Azim Premji University that you do cite, and you give reasons for why you rebut it. These were some of the headlines that we saw based on these research papers, both in the Economist and on CNN and other global news sites. And you've of course made the point that these were alarmist. Now I want to bring up Arvind Panagariya, what the Azim Premji research paper actually said. And this is one of the studies that you're refuting. That's why we say Panagariya refutes this study. They said 230 million Indians were pushed into poverty in 1 year. In 1 year of COVID. And this is one of the studies. Your paper opens with saying, look, I have disagreements with how this sort of research was collated. They go on to say that there was a 15% increase in poverty in rural India. You've just explained to us why you disagree with that. And during COVID, there was a 20% surge in urban India. And basis this, you say a lot of global sort of platforms headlined a kind of dire situation for India. One of the problems you had is the methodology. You said that there was a kind of apples and oranges comparison of surveys. Do you want to elaborate on why you so strongly refute this study?
Okay, so Azim Premji University study, I don't fully understand how they are getting to their numbers for this reason. Normally, look, these numbers on poverty and inequality are derived from household surveys. You take a large number of households, which is representative of the population. Typically, it can be anywhere between 120 to 150,000 households. So it's a very large survey, and they do use the CMIE survey. Yes. As does another study, by the way, by Anup Malani and his co-authors. Yes. Now, one of the very interesting points is that the two studies have a very opposite view of the inequality. So let's forget for the moment poverty, but on inequality, Azim Premji's study says that inequality massively went up. And Malani et al., they say that inequality fell dramatically, and urban inequality particularly fell. They're using the same household survey. How can that be? And this is where the answer. This is where one has to begin to investigate. I think Malani et al. Do it correctly, because what they do basically is that, look, here from the households we know what the bottom 10% households per capita income was, what the next 10% households made on per capita basis, what the next 10 and all. And so we can measure now inequality based on this. That's not what Azim Premji University study does. It somehow does some sort of event study. And my sort of hunch is very probable. I mean, again, it's hard to read into motivations why they did it this way. But it's very likely that their prior was that inequality should have gone up, and the data actually showed that it didn't go up. If you actually look at it, and this is done very extensively by Anup Malani and his co-authors, using exactly the same household survey.
So if I'm not wrong, Anup Malani's survey says poverty went up but inequality did not.
Yes.
Am I right?
Absolutely.
And the Azim Premji says both went up, and you say both went down, except for one quarter.
Urban poverty. Well, rural poverty for 1 quarter, and urban poverty for 4 quarters.
Now, how would you explain inequality falling? That I want you to explain. I can understand the point you make about agricultural activity in rural India cushioning the majority of Indians against the blow of what could have been a dire situation. I can understand you're saying the government stepped in very quickly with Narega, with direct cash deposits in banks and so on. All of that, okay. How do you explain the inequality aspect, that inequality fell? How do you explain that?
Okay. So, Barkha, normally, right, almost everybody says that when growth happens and per capita incomes rise and so forth rapidly, inequality rises. That's often, it's not always true, but that is the kind of, because at the top end, the incomes rise fast, faster than at the remaining, part of the household distribution. Well, reverse that process. In this case, incomes are actually declining. And where are they going to decline more? They are going to decline more at the very high end. That's a sort of, first cut point. But in this case, what is going on? In this case, what is going on is that we are talking, first of all, it is the urban inequality which is falling significantly faster. Rural also falls, in my data at least. And overall inequality falls even faster at the national level. Now, what is actually declining the fastest during this period is the contact-intensive activities. And many of these contact-intensive activities are impacting the incomes at the higher end a lot more than they are impacting at the very low end. That's part of the explanation. And also, mind you, that the government has stepped in urban areas also. That 5 kilogram of free food grain that was distributed was also distributed to about 50% of urban population. So that also is helping the urban lower end households as well.
So basically you're saying also, apart from all the points you're making, that if economic activity halts, then capacity to spend also halts, and therefore the kind of inequality that one sees otherwise would actually be less in a period of low economic activity. I know I'm paraphrasing without the requisite complexity, but am I kind of getting it right?
Close, but there is one important element here. You see that what we are measuring is the expenditure here, right? And when the contact intensive activities stop happening,
yes,
where does it impact more? I mean, we all stopped going to the restaurants, so it impacted those who were employed at restaurants also. But in our expenditures, in the richer people's expenditures, the part of the expenditure that was being done on going to restaurant meals, that got cut out. We
Right.
stopped going to tourism. We didn't go to, get these expensive vacations. That expenditure came down. So the expenditure at the top end declined much more than it
Yeah.
declined at the lower end.
Got it. But you've referred, as I said, to headlines on CNN, on The Economist, sort of talking, as it were, about what the pandemic was doing. One of the arguments made by, let's say, the Oxfam inequality report was that billionaires actually got richer. The Oxfam report argued that billionaires increased their wealth by 35% during the lockdown. And you would have seen the most recent figure, which says that 5% of India controls 60% of wealth. So most people sort of, those are the headlines that stay, that there's a sense of India becoming a more unequal country, not a less unequal country. How do you look at those headlines?
Yeah, I mean, there's crazy headlines. You see, first of all, the one that you are running here by the CNN, that
Yes.
is based on the Azim Premji University study. At least that's what they say. That's the only
Yes.
thing they quote in that study. So whether Azim Premji University study actually says about anything about billionaires or not, I do not know. But because I didn't, fully look for it, it's a very long report. But for CNN headline, let's say, I mean, that survey on which the Azim Premji University study is based doesn't have a single billionaire. They cannot capture anything about the billionaire in that survey. So that is prima facie makes no sense whatsoever. But more so, coming to the broader kind of Oxfam kind of claims.
Yeah.
I mean, look, take the fiscal year 2021. GDP fell by 6.6% rather than grow by at least 4%, which was the case in 1920. But if you take the earlier period, it's closer to 7%, about for a 5 or 6 year period preceding 1920. It fell by 6.6%. I mean, you think the billionaire incomes are rising? If billionaire incomes are rising, GDP would not fall by this kind of level. So it doesn't even meet the basic smell test, any claims of billionaires actually getting better. We all know what was happening to the, all the economic activities which bring bigger income and wealth to the billionaires. Virtually all economic activity, particularly in the urban areas, which is where the billionaires are making their incomes, had greatly slowed down. I mean, you look at the interviews by the industrialists at the time. I remember, one of the Bajaj brothers, right? He was very opposed to the strict lockdown.
Rajiv
Rajiv,
Bajaj.
right? Rajiv,
That's right. Yeah.
Rajiv Bajaj was very opposed to the lockdown, precisely because it brought his own factories to a complete halt. How could he be making more billions at that time?
Yeah. So you don't take those reports very seriously, but I want to pick up on Narega. You mentioned what a key role it played in actually containing what could have happened in rural India. I ask you about this because there's an ongoing debate about allocations for Narega in the last budget, and activists are sort of very anguished that the allocations have reduced. The government has said we will give allocations when needed, but now there's a debate over the wages that are being given to workers, which are not more than minimum wages in several states. How do you look at the cut in the Narega allocation? I know I'm steering slightly away from your paper, but moving ahead, how do you look at that cut? Do you think the government should restore that? Do you think there was a mistake in that?
Yeah, look, as far as I understand the government position, it is that if there is more demand, more funds will be provided, which has been done in the past. There is no doubt to that. So, the allocation is, to me, an indicative figure. And what a lot of the NGOs and activists are reacting to is the figure in the budget. Now, if there are complaints about, on demand, it's not being provided, I think that's an issue. But it's both. Remember that not all of the Narega funds come from the central government. Part of it, at least a small part of it, does come from the state. and state also has to chip in, so without the state chipping in, the center cannot proceed.
Let's talk a little bit about the larger sort of health of the Indian economy. Looking at your most recent paper as a starting point, there has been a great deal of debate. Everybody agrees that India is one of the fastest growing economies in the world. But what the trajectory or those numbers might be, there's some sort of debate on. There is the IMF forecast, and there is the S&P forecast, and then on the other hand, there are economists like Raghuram Rajan who look at the 4.4 GDP figure of of the last quarter and say we'll be lucky if we even get to 5. He doesn't agree with these forecasts. Where do you sort of place the GDP growth numbers in your estimation?
As you know, Barkha, I am an optimist on this,
Yes.
and I go out on my limb on these estimates. First of all, when everybody was bringing down their forecast for the current fiscal year, which or the fiscal year that just ended, 22-23. Everybody was bringing it down to below 7%, strictly below 7%, not even at 7. I had been arguing, and this may have been in October and November. I'm on the record on this one, having said that we will easily cross 8%. Now, if I go by the base year GDP for 21-22, which prevailed at the time I was talking about it in October, November, we did cross in 2022-23 8%. It's only because that they revised the figures for 21-22 upward quite a bit, and so we came to 7%. So I was seen completely out of my mind predicting crossing 8%, but we did. Okay, now going forward, I mean, again, I still think that 7% very much will grow on a longer term basis, meaning if we take a decade or so, that is still to unfold. And I say this, and I've said this about a year ago, that look, finally we are in a kind of spot now where we were around 2003-4, when for the first time the economy grew about 8%. The balance sheets of banks and corporations both are very fully cleaned up, in good shape. And the investment to GDP ratio is showing very good signs. This is again, somehow I do not know how in the news kind of this fiction evolves and continues. But if you look at the data, the investment to GDP ratio has been steadily rising. It had fallen to about 29%. And it went up to 31, 32, and now it's 34%, for the current latest, the second advanced estimate for GDP that places the investment to GDP ratio at 34%. This is at constant prices. There is some discrepancy between current prices versus constant prices, but I think it makes perfect sense to use the Economist will choose, especially when comparing over time, you want to do it at the constant prices. And that's about 34%. So, compared to what it was at the peak, which was 2007-8, if I remember correctly, that must have been closer to 36 or 37%. So we haven't got to that level, but it looks pretty decent. And all the other reforms that had been done have not fully yet paid off. Labor law reform, of course, has not even been implemented yet. So I expect that this will happen in another 6 months to a year, and which will bear fruit as we go over the decade. So that's my kind of general analysis and prediction.
So let me ask you this. You have this very interesting story, and I'd like our viewers to also hear it, that in 2019, in writing, you actually forecast a victory for Narendra Modi in the election. And soon after, you actually met with the Prime Minister. And you have gone on record in the last month itself to say that 2024 looks the same to you, and you have linked it back to certain welfare schemes in particular of the government. So I want you to talk a little bit about why, as a political economist, it is your belief that that is what and how 2024 will play out as, and what you think some of the key factors are for that victory that you sense is coming.
Okay, so a number of factors, Barkha, and these are very much similar to the factors I had pointed out in that April 2019 piece. Um, First of all, Prime Minister himself, I think he is a big factor. He has the trust of the people by and large, and he has successfully delivered what he has been promising to the people, particularly in terms of social programs. So we all know that, and that's generally accepted, that using the DBT and so forth, not only the programs have become far more effective, but there has been expansion of some of these programs and all, and there is this generally, the beneficiaries of which, which in number easily more than half the population do see that they are receiving the benefits that the Prime Minister says they are receiving. So that's one basic factor. Second, I would say that the Prime Minister himself is an incredible campaigner. Once he gets to gets on the campaign trail, we have all seen that, and his ability to crisscross the entire country multiple times. We saw that. I sort of was observing even in 2014 very closely, and it was quite remarkable how at that time his resources were probably less. So he was not the Prime Minister of the country, but he still managed to, how he crisscrossed the country. I think he will also get some support for having handled the entire COVID period quite well. There was a small period of Delta wave, and in the initial lockdown, when a lot of the migrants actually, those images came through on the television and so forth. So they were, but overall, if one looks at it, 2.2 billion jabs for a country like India to so flawlessly kind of administer, it is just absolute tribute to the people who were involved in the entire operation. I think, I've seen this in the US and all, has been a struggle. Not so in India, it is a remarkable feat. So I think that part will give him good goodwill with the people. And I think there is also one negative side of it, which is that, unfortunately, the opposition is not offering a good, credible alternative. I think, that somehow the opposition has gotten very badly fragmented, and it's at the very tail end, if you put it sort of, some sort of election platform which has sensible things, which most parties seem to put together eventually, but that doesn't get transmitted to the people. But what gets transmitted is what, the debate that precedes for a whole year, the election. And when you look at that, then, there is a problem that there is not a well thought out agenda being put up by the opposition.
Let me ask you in the end, the one standout economic policy or economic program of the government that you believe will be the political game changer of the next election.
I avoid making pointing finger at one or two. I think it has to be the I just don't believe a lot of people also in my profession say that, what are one or two reforms that you say would change everything. No, I think reform is a continuous process. You cannot, by changing two or three policies, turn the economy around. I think that requires sustained effort for decades, and particularly in our democratic system, where we have put in so many regulations that you remove one, that the next one basically becomes the binding constraint. So it is, you cannot really produce, look, I mean, we know our experience. Narasimha Rao did so many reforms, Atal Bihari Vajpayee did so many reforms. After that is when we then began to get 8% growth, which was then sustained during the UPA years. So it's not a mechanical process with one or two things.
Sure. Well, Arvind Panagariya, fascinating talking to you. I think that paper in particular that you have co-authored is going to set the cat among the pigeons. There's going to be a lot of debate on it, a lot of chatter around it already. And we hope to have you back as more conversations take place around your argument that neither poverty nor inequality, except for one distinct quarter in the stern lockdown really was impacted in a cataclysmic way, and that India is well on the way in an optimistic, upbeat growth trajectory. Thank you so much, Dr. Panagariya. Pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Barkha. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, sir. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.